Well, I grew up in Princeton, New Jersey, and my brother, who's 2 years younger than me, and I don't know, just around age 10, 11, that age, started listening to jazz, old jazz and blues from the 20s and 30s. And then when I got to be 12, 13, I started listening to rock and roll. That was 1954, 55. And at the same time, my grandmother had been a classical concert pianist and taught other concert pianists, and I took lessons from her. So I was hearing a lot of classical music as well, and all these three kinds of music in a way were around me from an early age. And my brother and I became very avid collectors of old 78s and LP reissues, and the best reissues, the best LPs, which were compilations of stuff from the early days of jazz and blues, all seemed to come from Europe. And so I got it kind of fixed in my mind that Europe was a kind of promised land of people who shared my enthusiasm for this music. And I decided that's where I would go, and that's what I did. I had this obsession with old records from the 20s and 30s, and I also loved rock and roll from the 50s. And that's what you play at dances, and you dance at parties, and it was teenage music. And to me, the two things were completely separate. You know, one was a sort of almost slightly nerdy, secret occupation that I did in the afternoons, and then in the evenings I'd go meet friends and, listen to contemporary stuff. And it wasn't until about 1959, 60, that I finally got it, that it was just a continuum, that the kind of music that Fats Domino and Little Richard and Chuck Berry was making in the 50s was the same stuff that it was just the modern version of the stuff from the 30s that I loved so much in another compartment of my life. Yeah. And so at that point, because I had read books about the early days of recording, and I kind of idolized these early producers, guys like Ralph Peer, who would go around the South and record blues singers and country singers, and rent a room in a hotel and set up a microphone and record Robert Johnson, And once I got that the whole thing was connected, I went, oh, that means I can be like him. I can do the same thing that he did, only today. And so I decided at age 17 that I would be a record producer. And I know it sounds silly in this day and age when, today when, it's like somebody says, oh, I'd like to be a record producer, and it seems like an incredibly difficult thing to get into. And I don't know, maybe it was in some ways in those days, but it was very different. And I think that not that many people were aware of what being a record producer was. It wasn't like a glamorous sort of activity that lots of people were wanting to do. It was kind of something a bit new as an idea of what you would do with your career or your life or something. So the fact that I was very focused and very determined to do that, I just kind of, forced my way in. I had a friend who I'd known I went to Harvard, and I had hung out in the folk scene of Harvard Square at that time, and I'd met a guy who worked for a local record distributor and who'd started making records of local folk singers just with his own money, and then made deals for them with a label in New York, And one thing led to another. He got an A&R man's job and a producer's job in New York, and then he moved to Elektra Records. And so he and I stayed in touch. We stayed friends, and I got a job tour managing blues singers going to England. And I came back from England and said, told him about all the great things that were happening here and all these young kids who were emulating the old Chicago blues singers and doing all this stuff. And they were all on top of the pops, and then that within a year, within sort of 8 months of that, my return from England, Bob Dylan had plugged in his electric guitar at Newport, and I had been the production manager at the Newport Folk Festival, and so I was right in the middle of that. And I had tipped off this friend of mine at Elektra to some acts that he signed, and so he sort of felt he owed me a favor. I think he also thought I could be an asset to Elektra. Yeah. And I had been in England, and I had come back full of opinions about Elektra's distribution was no good, the promotion was no good. I told him all my complaints about what Elektra was doing in England. And the next thing I knew, I got offered the job of going back to England to open the Elektra office there and get things running right. So that was my big break into the music business, into the record business. I'd been sort of in the live music business. And what better time, autumn of 1965. And I think the first night that I arrived here to take up that job, I knew John Hopkins from my previous time in England. And I got in touch with him, and he said, come on over tomorrow night. We're having this meeting. We're starting this project called the London Free School, which was very much a thing of Harrow Road, Ladbroke Grove, Notting Hill Gate. And so I was never a real active core member of the London Free School, but I knew everybody, and I went to the meetings, and I went to the place on Powis Square where they had their sort of clubhouse, and so I was aware of everything that was going on, so I felt sort of part of that whole thing, and that was, again, a fantastic door into the whole underground scene that was happening here in West London. Well, I think for me as a producer, the most influential person really was Paul Rothchild, because he got me a start, and he, in fact, was a really, really good producer. He produced The Doors later on, and he produced Janis Joplin, and his records sound great, and I really learned a lot from hanging out with him and watching him in the studio and things like that. So I would say that Paul was a key figure. But I think in other ways, not specifically in the studio, but just generally with a kind of, I think Hoppy was a big influence. Yeah. I learned a huge amount from Hoppy.
In what sense?
Well, I think Hoppy was very smart and very unafraid and very open to things and very inspirational to people and very, to him, he loved jazz. He was a big jazz fan, and he had a whole career as a photographer before he started the International Times and the London Free School and everything. And he took some great pictures of jazz groups, and but that's just that idea that to him it was all the same thing. Whether he was photographing John Lee Hooker, Brian Jones, or Muddy Waters, or Thelonious Monk, or eventually, the Floyd, he just had this kind of enthusiasm that had no judgmental barriers. You know, it wasn't like, I'm a fan of this and therefore I don't like that. It was like everything was
Just open.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that was he was sort of the epitome of that spirit which was around in the 60s. And I think it was very infectious. I thought the scene here was great. You know, it was. I went to a pub. I was visited. Well, I kind of got intrigued by the folk scene here. I mean, there was certainly an obvious. I mean, the whole world knew about what was going on with the Beatles and the Stones. I mean, that wasn't a great secret. But the folk scene was kind of a revelation to me. You know, I heard a lot of English folk singers and groups playing stuff that I'd never heard before, kind of Celtic folk music and English folk music. And I really liked this group called the Ian Campbell folk group. And I met them and they invited me to come hang out with them in Birmingham. And I went up there to Birmingham and in a pub I met this guy that had been to the blues concert that I presented in Birmingham Town Hall a year before. And he said, there's a group you should hear. What are you doing tomorrow night? Let's meet and I'll take you down to this pub and you can hear this group. And I went to hear this in this little pub in Birmingham, and there was the Spencer Davis group with Stevie Winwood singing, age 15 or 16, you know, with this unbelievable voice. And they were doing, it wasn't just Chicago blues, they were doing like Lead Belly songs and sort of folk, what I thought of as folk songs, but with a rock band, or what was called in those days a beat group. Mm-hmm. The word rock didn't exist. And that was the thing that was interesting to me, was like, oh, Lead Belly songs, folk songs, the kinds of things that people were playing in coffee houses in America, but with electric guitars. And so that was kind of what I told Paul Rothchild about when I went back to America. And we tried to form a group, a kind of folk rock super group with folk singers from Greenwich Village. And some of the members of our group that we put together who met each other that way then went on to form the Loving Spoonful, Sal Janowski and John Sebastian. And then everything blew wide open that summer when Dylan played electric guitar at Newport. And then when I came back here with Elektra, I met Paul Jones, who was the lead singer of Manfred Mann, and he'd been on top of it. He was a blues fanatic. And he'd been to the blues tour that I'd been with a year and a half before. And so, you know, he helped me put together this recording that I did with Eric Clapton and Steve Winwood and him, and for part of a compilation that Elektra was doing. And so, you know, I had the opportunity at that time. Eric Clapton was unsigned, you know, and I tried to get Elektra to sign Eric Clapton, and the head of Elektra wouldn't give me much of a budget, and I don't think we had a chance to sign him really, but he liked me and we got along. So it was sort of one of those fish that got away stories, and there was so much going on, but then by the summer of '66, what was going on was raising money for the London Free School at the Linda Church Hall in Palace Square, which I just drove by on my bicycle, and which is no longer there. It was torn down. They've got modern flats there. But that was where Pink Floyd started. And they'd started out as a blues band as well, but they'd gone off in a new direction.
Yeah.